The prologue, the shadow behind the curtain. He's gone. Matthew Reyes is dead. The voice is like a hospital noose, cold and final. From this moment, you are the heir to the Black legacy. Do not fail me. The response is a lethal calm that vibrates with hidden intent. Watch me. I will manage this family in a way you never imagined. Cameras 1, 2, and 3 ready. Lights in position. The newsroom is a cathedral of icy malice, where seconds are the currency of power. Nicole, the station wants Bianca to co-anchor. Why are you blocking it? Nicole doesn't flinch. Her disciplined vigilance is absolute. My program is solo. I am not a stepping stone for the mediocre. Move aside, Bianca. Don't cause a live broadcast incident on my watch. 30 seconds to air. 9, 8, 7. Hello everyone. I am Nicole Flores. The chandeliered glow of the studio monitors illuminates her immovable grace, but underneath, the rhythmic tension of a secret grief still hums. The investment promotion dinner is a sea of bespoke suits and arrogant gatekeeping. Nicole is there to secure the station's future, unaware that a clinical sabotage of her life has already been signed. The Black Group's young master is here. The whisper travels through the room like a signal of impending doom. He's signed an exclusive contract with the station, but he specified only one partner. Nicole Flores. Me? The wide-eyed shock begins to take root. Does he even know me? The doors swing open. The calculating quiet of the room shatters as a man walks in with a god complex that stills the air. Nicole freezes. Her hollow grief turns into a deep, agonizing crack. Matthew Reyes. How can he still be alive? Her internal scream is a fatal detail the world can't see. Miss Flores, the man says, his voice a precision instrument of icy malice that hides a love beyond life. I believe we have a partnership to discuss. The chandeliered glow of the grand ballroom felt like a hospital noose as Nicole Flores stood near the podium, her immovable grace masking the deep, agonizing crack in her reality. Across the room, the woman she had just seen, the man she had buried in her heart 2 years ago, was moving toward the stage. Matthew Reyes didn't walk like a ghost. He moved with a lethal calm that commanded the calculating quiet of the elite crowd. Every footstep on the polished floor was a signal of the absolute finality he was bringing to her life. Beside her, Bianca smoothed her dress, her face a mask of arrogant gatekeeping. Bianca had spent the last hour whispering about young Master Black and how the station needed a fresh, collaborative face to lead the new investment partnership, a clear clinical sabotage directed at Nicole's solo career. But as the station director stepped up to the microphone, the anatomy of a lie that Bianca had been building began to dissolve. Everyone, I have a monumental announcement, the director said, his voice reflecting the grit and grease of a man who had just secured the deal of a lifetime. The Black Group has officially signed an exclusive contract with our station. However, young Master Black has set one non-negotiable condition. He has specified only one person to lead this partnership, and that person is Nicole Flores. The room underwent an immediate status collapse. The wide-eyed shock on Bianca's face was a fatal detail that Nicole barely registered because her own world was spinning. She felt the hospital noose tighten. Matthew, or Charlie Black as he was now called, stopped just a few feet away. He didn't look at the director. He didn't look at the flashing cameras. He performed an audit of Nicole with an icy malice that made the air between them turn brittle. But director, Bianca stammered, her arrogant gatekeeping turning into aggression and desperation. The station strategy was for a dual anchor team. I was told. You were told wrong. Matthew's voice cut through the air, a precision instrument of authority. He didn't even grant Bianca the courtesy of a glance. His god complex was absolute, his focus entirely on Nicole. I don't work with teams. I work with excellence. And Miss Flores is the only one in this building who doesn't look like a docile shadow trying to catch a ride on someone else's coattails. The theater of cruelty shifted. Bianca stepped back, her reputation suffering a total status collapse in front of the city's most influential investors. Nicole stood frozen, her hollow grief battling with the fierce fury of being used as a pawn in his grit and grease underworld games. She looked into his eyes, searching for a signal of the Matthew she had known, the man she had loved beyond life, but she found only the lethal calm of a stranger. "Why me?" Nicole whispered, her voice a precision instrument of her own disciplined vigilance. Matthew stepped closer, his proximity creating a shadow behind the curtain that isolated them from the room. "Because, Nicole," he said, his voice dropping to a low, icy vibration, "you once told me you wouldn't be a stepping stone for anyone. I'm simply making sure you stay on the pedestal I built for you." The investor's trap had snapped shut. Nicole was no longer just a news anchor. She was the sovereign partner of a man she feared and a ghost she mourned. As the chandeliered glow of the ballroom continued to shine, the next action was clear. She was bound to the iron architect of her own nightmare, and the reckoning of their shared past was just beginning. The chandeliered glow of the ballroom felt like a cage as Matthew led Nicole toward the private VIP lounge, his hand resting on the small of her back with a lethal calm that sent tremors through her immovable grace. To the room, it looked like a sovereign union, but to Nicole, it was the start of a clinical sabotage of her sanity. She needed a signal, some fatal detail, to prove that the man behind the icy malice of Charlie Black was the same Matthew Reyes she had mourned. As they entered the secluded glass-walled room, the calculating quiet of the executive suite settled over them. Nicole's disciplined vigilance kicked into high gear. She watched him set his crystal glass down on a polished obsidian side table, his movements precise and cold. This was her moment for a fingerprint audit. If she could just get his glass, she could run the prints against the old records she had kept in her private safe, the only anatomy of a lie she had ever maintained. "You're staring, Nicole," Matthew remarked, his voice a precision instrument of amusement. He didn't look at her. He was pouring a second drink, his back turned with an arrogant god complex that dared her to move. "I'm trying to understand the anatomy of power," she replied, her voice steady despite the rhythmic tension in her chest. She moved toward the obsidian table, her fingers hovering near the rim of his discarded glass. "How a man can die in a grit and grease accident 2 years ago and reappear as the iron architect of the city's largest criminal conglomerate." Just as her fingertips brushed the cold crystal, Matthew turned. With a lethal calm that was almost predatory, he reached out, not for her hand, but for the glass. Before she could secure the prints, he swiped a linen napkin across the surface, performing a deliberate clinical sabotage of her investigation right before her eyes. The smudge was a deep, agonizing crack in her plan. "Searching for ghosts is a paper gamble, Nicole," he whispered, leaning in until the shadow behind the curtain of his presence overwhelmed her. He held the now clean glass up to the light, mocking her with its clarity. "Charlie Black doesn't have a past. He only has a next action. And currently, that action involves you staying very close to the iron shield." Nicole felt a wide-eyed shock take hold. He knew. He was playing a theater of cruelty, dangling the truth in front of her only to snatch it away with icy malice. He wasn't just back. He was performing an audit of her loyalty before the game had even truly begun. "You have his eyes," she breathed, her hollow grief surfacing for a fleeting second. "Then perhaps you should stop looking for what's hidden and start focusing on the hospital noose currently tightening around her station," Matthew countered, his tone returning to absolute finality. He set the glass back down, but this time, he gripped it with the napkin, leaving nothing behind but the grit and grease of her own desperation. The fingerprint audit had failed, and as the chandeliered glow dimmed for the evening's main event, Nicole realized that in this cathedral of icy malice, the iron architect was always 3 steps ahead. The calculating quiet of the executive suite was broken by the sharp, digital chirp of a phone. Matthew Reyes didn't look at the screen. He didn't have to. He slid the device across the obsidian table toward Nicole with a lethal calm that made her skin crawl. On the screen, a grainy video feed flickered to life, showing a dimly lit room where Miles, her anchor to the normal life, sat bound to a chair. There was no blood, no visible grit and grease of a struggle, but the absolute threat was unmistakable. Miles looked like a docile shadow of his former self, his eyes wide with a wide-eyed panic that mirrored Nicole's own. "He's a good man, isn't he?" Matthew's voice was a precision instrument of psychological pressure. He stood by the window, his silhouette outlined against the chilling pale gray skyline of the city. A bit soft, perhaps. A bit too trusting of the anatomy of a lie that is safety in this city. He doesn't understand that the iron shield of the law is easily pierced. Nicole felt the hospital noose tighten around her heart. Every instinct screamed at her to lash out, to perform a fierce fury of an escape, but the sight of Miles kept her paralyzed in a state of hollow grief. Matthew wasn't just holding a man, he was holding her morality as ransom. He was forcing her out of the chandeliered glow of her professional life and dragging her into the shades of gray where the black group operated. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice a deep, agonizing crack in her usual immovable grace. Matthew turned, his icy malice replaced by a terrifyingly soft tenderness. He walked toward her, his proximity creating a suffocating shadow behind the curtain. "I want your eyes, Nicole. Not for the news, but for me. There is a mole within my cathedral of icy malice, someone performing a clinical sabotage on my shipments. They know my guards, they know my disciplined vigilance, but they don't know you." He leaned in, his breath a signal of the absolute finality of her situation. "You will go into the grit and grease of my world. You will find the traitor. And for every day you delay, Miles loses a piece of the world he thinks he knows. This is your next action, Nicole. Accept the marriage, accept the contract, and enter my cathedral. Or watch your leverage disappear into the shades of gray." Nicole looked at the phone, then at the man she had loved beyond life, who was now the very architect of her hell. The anatomy of power was clear. She was no longer a sovereign of the airwaves. She was a pawn in a theater of cruelty. As she reached out to take the phone, accepting the hospital noose he had placed around her neck, she realized that the Tuesday surprise of his return was just the first step in a status collapse that would leave her forever changed. She was entering the shades of gray, and the only way out was to become as lethal as the man who held the leash. The chandeliered glow of the black group's private gala was not a sanctuary, it was a cathedral of icy malice, where every clinking glass and whispered greeting felt like the cocking of a hidden weapon. Nicole moved through the room with immovable grace, the silk of her evening gown whispering against the polished marble, but her disciplined vigilance was tuned to the signals beneath the surface. Matthew stood near the obsidian bar, a silhouette of lethal calm that acted as her iron shield, yet she knew that within this theater of cruelty, she was the only one performing a clinical sabotage of the status quo. Her objective was clear: identify the mole. Matthew had whispered the names, 3 high-level executives, each a shattered icon of loyalty, suspected of leaking shipping routes to the rival white family. Nicole carried a tray of vintage champagne, her waitress's eyes scanning for the fatal detail, a nervous tick, a clandestine glance, or a paper gamble exchanged in the shades of gray, near the balcony. She was no longer the sovereign of the evening news. She was a ghost in the grit and grease of the underworld, her amnesia regarding her past acting as a shadow behind the curtain that Matthew used to his advantage. She approached the first target, Director Han, whose arrogant gatekeeping was well known in the industry. As she offered a glass, she leaned in, her voice a precision instrument of feigned curiosity. "I heard the young master is rerouting the Incheon shipment. Such a bold next action, don't you think?" Han didn't flinch. His lethal calm was as cold as the ice in his drink. But when she moved toward the second target, a man named Vane whose god complex made him prone to aggression and desperation, she felt the rhythmic tension in the air shift. Vane's fingers tightened around his glass, a deep, agonizing crack in his professional mask. He didn't look at her. He looked at Matthew, his eyes reflecting a wide-eyed panic that he tried to bury under a layer of icy malice. The Incheon route is a hospital noose for anyone trying to interfere, Vane muttered, his voice a signal of guilt that Nicole caught instantly. Before she could retreat, a hand gripped her elbow, not Matthew's tenderness, but the rough grit and grease of a guard who hadn't been told she was sovereign. The traitor's game had just become a physical removal scenario. Nicole maintained her immovable grace as she was led toward a shadowed alcove, her hollow grief surfacing as she realized how deep the anatomy of a lie went within this building. She looked toward Matthew, seeking the Iron Architect, but he remained still, watching the theater of cruelty unfold from across the room. He was testing her. He was waiting to see if she could survive the shades of gray on her own. As the hospital noose of the guard's grip tightened, Nicole knew her next action would define whether she was a victim or a sovereign player in this cathedral of icy malice. The cathedral of icy malice suddenly fractured as the guard's hospital noose on Nicole's arm was severed by a sharp, metallic, absolute finality. Matthew had moved, not with the loud grit and grease of a brawl, but with the precision instrument, speed of a man who lived in the shades of gray. Before the wide-eyed panic could fully settle in the room, a glass shattered near the executive table, and the rhythmic tension of the gala turned into a theater of cruelty. A waiter, performing a clinical sabotage of the evening's piece, lunged forward with a glint of steel. Matthew didn't flinch. He caught the assassin's wrist, the deep, agonizing crack of bone echoing through the calculating quiet. In the chaos, a tray of crystal glasses overturned, the fine wine pooling like a fatal detail on the white marble. But it wasn't the blade that posed the absolute threat. "Nicole, don't breathe," Matthew commanded, his voice a lethal calm that acted as her only iron shield. He pulled her into a secluded alcove, his body shielding hers as a faint, sweet scent. The anatomy of a lie, in the form of a gaseous toxin, began to waft through the vents. In the dim, shadowed corner, the status collapse of the outside world faded. Here, in the shades of gray, the icy malice Matthew usually projected finally dissolved into an impossible peace. For the first time since his resurrection, he wasn't the Iron Architect or the cruel boss. He was simply a man holding the only person he had ever loved beyond life. He pressed her back against the cool stone, his hand cupping her cheek with a tenderness that felt like a signal from a forgotten past. Nicole looked up, her wide-eyed shock softening into a hollow grief as she recognized the warmth in his gaze. The grit and grease of the Mafia war was just inches away, yet in this pocket of calculating quiet, they found a moment of impossible peace. "I told you I would protect you," he whispered, his breath a precision instrument of comfort against her skin. "Even if I have to burn this cathedral to the ground to do it." Nicole felt the deep, agonizing crack in her own defenses. The man she was forced to marry was the same man she had mourned, and for a heartbeat, the anatomy of power didn't matter. There was only the rhythmic tension of their breathing and the fatal detail of his thumb tracing her lower lip. It was a poison and passion moment, a dangerous, intoxicating signal that their connection was the only thing real in a world of clinical sabotage. As the emergency fans cleared the air and the disciplined vigilance of his enforcers secured the room, the impossible peace shattered. Matthew's mask of lethal calm returned, the iron shield slamming back into place. He pulled away, leaving Nicole in a state of wide-eyed panic, realizing that the next action would be more dangerous than the last. The reckoning was no longer just about the mole, it was about the fierce fury of a love that refused to die. The calculating quiet of the safe house was absolute, a stark departure from the theater of cruelty they had just escaped at the gala. Matthew stood before a wall of monitors, his lethal calm returning as he performed a digital audit of the night's failures. Nicole sat on the edge of a leather sofa, her immovable grace fractured by the rhythmic tension of the evening. She watched the way his silhouette moved against the glowing screens, a precision instrument of authority that still felt like a shadow behind the curtain of the man she once knew. Matthew reached into a hidden compartment of his desk and pulled out a weathered, silver locket, a fatal detail from a life lived before the grit and grease of the Black family had consumed him. He opened it, his icy malice softening into a hollow grief that Nicole could feel from across the room. On the screen beside him, he had pulled up a signal from the orphanage's digital archives, a scanned record of a girl named Nikki who had vanished from the system 20 years ago. "You don't remember, do you?" Matthew's voice was a low vibration, a signal meant only for her. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the photo on the screen, comparing the wide-eyed shock of the child to the woman sitting behind him. "You don't remember the impossible piece of the courtyard, or the vow I made when they took you away." Nicole felt a deep, agonizing crack in her memory. The amnesia she had carried like a hospital noose for years began to slip. She looked at the locket in his hand, a precision instrument of her own past. A flash of chilling pale gray winter light at the orphanage hit her, a boy with lethal calm, eyes promising to find her, no matter the status collapse of their lives. "Matthew," she breathed, the name a sovereign key that unlocked the anatomy of a lie she had been living. He turned his iron shield completely down. He held out the locket, the silver gleaming under the chandeliered glow of the room's single light. "I spent 2 years in the shades of gray, making sure the world believed Matthew Reyes was dead, so I could build the Iron Architect that could finally protect you. I didn't return to perform a clinical sabotage on your life, Nicole. I returned because my soul is bound to yours beyond life." The wide-eyed panic that had defined her morning was replaced by a fierce fury of realization. The marriage, the leverage of Miles, the traitor's game, it was all a theater of cruelty designed to keep her within the iron shield of his influence while he dismantled the cathedral of icy malice from the inside. He wasn't her captor. He was her resurrection. But as the orphanage signal flickered on the monitor, a new, absolute threat appeared. A notification pinged, a clinical sabotage of their moment of impossible peace. Philip Black's disciplined vigilance had caught a fatal detail of Matthew's private activities. The shadow behind the curtain was closing in. Matthew's face hardened, the lethal calm snapping back into place as he realized their next action would have to be their most dangerous yet. The Iron Coronation was still far off, and the reckoning of the Black family was about to become a physical removal of everything they held.
"Dear."
The calculating quiet of the safe house had become a hospital noose of conflicting loyalties. Despite the orphanage signal and the tenderness Matthew had shown, Nicole could not shake the absolute threat of the Black family's criminal legacy. She saw an opening during a high-stakes meeting at the docks, a chance to perform a clinical sabotage of her own captivity. The White family, the Black group's most bitter rivals, had sent an envoy, and Nicole intended to use their arrogant gatekeeping as a bridge to her freedom. She slipped away from the disciplined vigilance of the guards, moving through the shades of gray cast by the massive shipping containers. The air was thick with the grit and grease of the harbor, a stark contrast to the chandeliered glow of the news station she missed so dearly. She reached the White family's perimeter, her wide-eyed panic masked by a final surge of immovable grace. "I have information on Charlie Black," she told the lead enforcer, her voice a precision instrument of desperation. "Get me out of here, and I'll give you the anatomy of a lie he's been building." The White family enforcers circled her, their aggression and desperation palpable. They didn't see a sovereign or an ally. They saw a leverage, a fatal detail they could use to dismantle Matthew's cathedral of icy malice. Just as the lead man reached for her, intending to turn her escape into a physical removal, the temperature of the docks seemed to plummet. Matthew Reyes stepped out from the shades of gray, his lethal calm, so absolute it silenced the lapping waves against the pier. He didn't come with the grit and grease of a small army. He came alone, his presence an iron shield that radiated a god complex more terrifying than any weapon. He walked toward the group with a rhythmic tension that signaled an impending reckoning. "Step away from my wife," Matthew said, his voice a low vibration of absolute finality. The white enforcers hesitated, their disciplined vigilance failing them in the face of his icy malice. They knew the anatomy of power in this city, and they knew that the Iron Architect did not make idle threats. Matthew didn't look at them. His gaze was an audit focused entirely on Nicole, his eyes reflecting a deep, agonizing crack of betrayal masked by professional coldness. "You thought the White family would provide an impossible peace?" Matthew asked, his voice cutting through the calculating quiet as he reached her side. He didn't grab her with the grit and grease of the enforcers. His touch was a sovereign claim, a lethal rescue that felt like a hospital noose. He turned to the rival family, his lethal calm intensifying. "Tell your master that if he ever touches what is mine again, I will perform a clinical sabotage on his entire lineage that no one will survive." This status collapse of the White family's ambition was immediate. They retreated into the shades of gray, leaving Nicole standing in the grit and grease of the docks with the man who was both her absolute threat and her only protector. Matthew looked at her, the shadow behind the curtain of his anger flickering for just a moment. "The next action is back to the cathedral, Nicole. You've had your Tuesday surprise. Now it's time for the reckoning." He led her away, her physical ascent to freedom thwarted by the lethal gravity of a love she still didn't fully understand. The calculating quiet of Nicole's apartment was a fragile, iron shield that Matthew Reyes shattered the moment he stepped through the door. He didn't come with the grit and grease of a raid. He moved with a lethal calm that signaled the end of her paper gamble with a normal life. The air in the hallway felt like a hospital noose, as Matthew's presence forced a status collapse of the sanctuary she had tried to maintain for miles. "He's coming here, Nicole," Matthew stated, his voice a precision instrument of absolute finality. He stood in the center of her living room, a silhouette of icy malice against the chilling pale gray twilight. "Miles is on his way to check on you. He thinks he's your iron shield, but he's actually the fatal detail that Philip Black will use to perform a clinical sabotage on your soul." Nicole felt a deep, agonizing crack in her resolve. The rhythmic tension of the doorbell echoed through the foyer just as Matthew caught her gaze with an audit that demanded total submission. "Hide," he commanded, gesturing toward the master bathroom. "If he sees me here, his life becomes a next action for my father's enforcers. You want him to live? Then perform the reckoning now. End it, or watch him become a shattered icon of your indecision." The theater of cruelty was set. As Miles entered with a look of wide-eyed panic and tenderness, Matthew slipped into the shadows of the bathroom, leaving the door ajar, a shadow behind the curtain that Nicole knew was watching her every breath. "Nicole, thank God," Miles breathed, his voice a signal of a world she no longer belonged to. He reached for her, his touch a hollow grief compared to the lethal electricity Matthew commanded. "We have to leave. I've seen the news about the Black group. You're in a hospital noose, and I won't let them take you." Nicole looked past him, her disciplined vigilance fixed on the dark sliver of the bathroom door. She could feel Matthew's lethal calm radiating from the shades of gray. To save Miles, she had to perform a clinical sabotage of his heart. She had to become the cruel sovereign he wouldn't want to save. "You're a vulnerable giant, Miles," she said, her voice a precision instrument of feigned coldness. She stepped back, her immovable grace turning into a weapon of icy malice. "You think you're my protector? You're just a fatal detail in a life you don't understand. I didn't marry Charlie Black because I was forced. I married him because he is the Iron Architect of a world you aren't strong enough to inhabit." The status collapse on Miles's face was immediate. His wide-eyed shock was a deep, agonizing crack that mirrored her own internal torment. You don't mean that. This is the anatomy of a lie, Nicole. You're being clinical because you're scared." "I'm not scared, Miles. I'm sovereign," she lied, the grit and grease of the words coating her tongue. "Go back to your chilling pale gray life. You're a docile shadow compared to him. Don't ever come back." As Miles stumbled out of the apartment, his spirit a shattered icon, the calculating quiet returned, heavier than before. the bathroom door swung open, and Matthew stepped out. He didn't offer an impossible peace or tenderness. He looked at her with a lethal calm that acknowledged the physical removal of her past. "The reckoning is complete," Matthew whispered, his voice a signal of the absolute finality they now shared. "You've burned the bridge to the light, Nicole. Now, there is only the cathedral of icy malice, and the man who loved you beyond life, waiting in the shades of gray." He reached out, his hand a hospital noose that was also her only iron shield, pulling her into the next action of their shared nightmare. The calculating quiet of the high-rise executive suite was no longer a sanctuary, it was the epicenter of an absolute finality. Below, the city of Seoul was a tapestry of chilling pale gray and blue sirens, a signal that the cathedral of icy malice was finally being dismantled. Matthew Reyes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his lethal calm appearing as a shattered icon against the backdrop of the collapsing black group. The anatomy of a lie that had sustained his father's criminal empire for decades had been exposed, and the reckoning was now a matter of public record. "It's over, Nicole," Matthew whispered, his voice a precision instrument of exhausted relief. He didn't look at her. He was watching the digital audit of his family's assets being seized by the authorities. Every wire transfer and shipping manifest he had covertly leaked was now a hospital noose around Philip Black's neck. "The iron shield I built to protect you has done its job. The Black name is a shattered icon now." Nicole stepped forward, her immovable grace radiating even through the grit and grease of the night's trauma. She looked at the man who had been her absolute threat, her cruel boss, and finally, her sovereign protector. The deep, agonizing crack in her memory was gone. She saw him clearly now, the boy from the orphanage who had loved her beyond life. "But at what cost, Matthew?" she asked, her voice a signal of hollow grief. She saw the fatal detail on the desk, a signed confession and a surrender agreement. Matthew had performed a clinical sabotage on his own future to ensure her safety. By taking the fall for the family's smaller technicalities to keep the investigation focused on Philip, he had accepted a status collapse that would take him into the shades of gray for a long time. Matthew turned, his lethal calm softening into a tenderness that made the air in the room vibrate. He walked toward her, his proximity no longer a shadow behind a curtain but an impossible peace. He reached out and touched the emerald silk of her sleeve, his hand a signal of a love that had survived the grit and grease of the underworld. "The cost was never the point, Nicole. The next action was always you," he said, his eyes reflecting a sovereign certainty. "You are the iron coronation of everything I've done. You won't be a docile shadow in the newsroom anymore. You have the seat on the board. You have the truth. You are the only thing I loved beyond life, and that is the only anatomy of power that matters." As the heavy thud of the tactical team's boots echoed in the hallway, the absolute finality of the law, Matthew leaned in and pressed a final, lethal kiss to her forehead. It was a theater of cruelty in reverse, a parting that felt like a resurrection. The doors burst open, and the calculating quiet was replaced by the grit and grease of the arrest. Nicole stood in the center of the room, her immovable grace acting as an iron shield against the flashing lights and the wide-eyed panic of the staff. She watched them lead him away, his lethal calm, unwavering even as the hospital noose of the law closed around him. She wasn't a victim of a Tuesday surprise anymore. She was a sovereign who had inherited an empire to clean, a woman who carried the memory of a ghost who was very much alive. As she looked out at the city, the iron coronation was complete. She had lost the man who loved her beyond life, but she had gained the strength to ensure that his reckoning was not in vain. The Black Diamond had finally found her home in the light. The story serves as a critical study of corporate and organizational health. The Black Group operates as an anatomy of a lie, where arrogant gatekeeping and clinical sabotage are the standard methods of operation. It teaches that any organization built on a God complex and fear will eventually face an absolute finality. True sustainable power requires moving from the shades of gray into the light of accountability and ethical transparency. Nicole's immovable grace, in the face of extreme theater of cruelty, demonstrates the power of high emotional regulation. Despite the hospital news of her forced marriage and the wide-eyed panic of Miles's situation, she maintains disciplined vigilance. It illustrates that in high-stakes negotiation or conflict, the person who maintains their lethal calm and refuses to succumb to aggression and desperation retains the most strategic leverage. Matthew's arc represents a complex ethical case study. He performs a clinical sabotage on his own identity and future to provide an iron shield for Nicole. This highlights the concept of extreme ownership. Matthew accepts a total status collapse and legal reckoning to dismantle a corrupt system, teaching that leadership often requires the sacrifice of one's own standing for the greater good of another's safety and institutional reform. Nicole begins as a docile shadow, trapped by leverage and hollow grief. By the end, she rejects the role of a victim and accepts an iron coronation on the board of directors to lead the cleanup of the empire. It teaches that trauma or a temporary status collapse does not define an individual's final trajectory. One can move from being a fatal detail in someone else's game to becoming the iron architect of their own destiny by choosing to face consequences in the light. The orphanage signal and the ultimate dismantling of the Black group serve as reminders that the truth is a precision instrument that eventually cuts through any anatomy of a lie. In an environment of disciplined vigilance, secrets are temporary. The story emphasizes that long-term success is only possible when one's internal signals align with their external actions, avoiding the deep, agonizing crack of a double life.